So up to this point, I've been focusing exclusively on objections, criticisms of utilitarianism. But we also want to look at how utilitarians might respond to defend their position. And so we'll look at three different strategies that might be pursued independently or in combination by a utilitarian theorist to defend their view or to modify their view in light of these kinds of criticisms. And Rachel gives us these three different strategies. And so I'm going to start with the strategy where the utilitarian challenges the assumptions that are built into the objection, the way in which the objection is spelled out. So somebody like Mill might look at cases that purport to show very high happiness resulting from despicable, morally blameworthy actions and say, hey, your calculation, your hypothesis about the net happiness that results from these actions in these cases, in fact, that's systematically biased against utilitarianism. That's not an accurate or plausible calculation of the net happiness. And hence the objection doesn't run because the utility calculations aren't plausible from the utilitarian perspective. So how might this kind of objection go? Well, Rachel gives us the example of how someone might respond to that McCloskey case to illustrate how one might pursue this kind of response. So in the McCloskey case, we have this terrible sexual assault against a woman who's ethnically white. It looks like the suspect was ethnically African American. This elevates racial tensions, makes the likelihood of a race riot, chaotic, violent, unhappy outcomes look to be in the near future. But someone who has respect and authority decides, I'm going to short circuit that. I'm going to falsely accuse this person with someone specific to direct their anger towards. Racial tension will be diffused, there'll be no race riot, and the net happiness will be increased. Now, someone like Mill might well step into this McCloskey case and say, hold on, your supposition about how the world's going to work here is really systematically biased against utilitarians. Your calculations of the net overall happiness are flawed, and they're flawed by the presupposition that people who commit unjust acts are never discovered. The people, once unjust acts are discovered, never increase their animus as a result. People whose rights are violated, that's never detected, right? Those sorts of scenarios, they don't happen that much in the real world. In the real world, when people falsely accuse someone, eventually that gets exposed. When people violate somebody's rights, eventually that gets exposed. And so in this McCloskey case, this person falsely accuses someone, that's going to come out. And then if it comes out that this person was falsely accused, that's only going to increase the tensions and animus. It's only going to make a more widespread and horrific race riot more likely. And so it's really not going to result in this net increase in happiness by preventing this terrible outcome, because it really won't prevent this sort of tensions that are going to spiral into this kind of outcome in the way that you suggest. And similarly, in the case of the police officer who deceives and manipulates the assault victim to get those pictures, the case gets extrapolated to one where the police officer shares the photos with buddies, nobody ever detects it, there's no net terrible outcomes because nobody finds out about the violation. But in the real world, that isn't how it happened. In the real world, people who do stuff like this get caught. Miss York would report those photos being taken to her friends, and her friends would say, wait a minute, that's not something that police officers should do. People get caught when they violate people's rights. People get caught when they act unjustly. And so your calculations, your suppositions about the resulting net happiness in these cases are systematically and unfairly biased against the utilitarian. More realistic calculations of the net happiness would paint a different picture in these cases and wouldn't impugn utilitarianism in the way that you suggest. So that's how utilitarian theorists might respond on this first line of response. But suppose when utilitarians look at a case, they don't see a systematic bias in the calculations of net happiness in those cases. Suppose it really does look like, in some of these cases, that the greatest good for the greatest number is accomplished by acting in the way that's suggested in the objection. What ought the utilitarian to do then? Well, utilitarians like Mill or Sedgwick or Bentham might well look at cases like that and react in the way they reacted in real life. That is, they might say, look, I'm a hard-bitten, empirically driven theorist, and if you tell me that this is what is going to make the greatest good for the greatest number, then by golly, that's the ethically appropriate action. That's what really we ought to be doing. That's praiseworthy, even though it runs contrary to my common sense ethical notions or my ethical intuitions or my emotional reactions to the case. And so one thing that the utilitarian might do is defend the moral standing, the ethical standing of the action as it's portrayed in the objection, and argue that, in fact, it's not telling against utilitarianism. And how might that go? Well, look, what they'll usually say is something like, look, the whole point of having an ethical theory, the function that ethical theories are going to play in our lives, is to render our ethical actions, our principles, our intuitions consistent and defeasible. Now, when we adopt an ethical theory like this, sometimes, oftentimes probably, its verdicts are going to coincide with our pre-theoretic intuitions, with our common sense, ordinary ethical notions, with our emotional reactions to the cases that we're confronted with. But the whole point of having a theory, of trying to understand and explain the source of the ethical judgments that we make, is that sometimes those theories are going to expose inconsistent or indefeasible elements in our common sense, our ordinary ethical notions, in our ethical intuitive reactions or judgments, or in our emotional responses to cases. And when that happens, one option, sure, is to question the theory, but another option is to, in fact, recognize the inconsistency or the indefeasibility of our intuition or our ordinary notion or our emotional reaction to that case. So let's take an example and see how that might work. Now let's look at these cases where utilitarianism seems to make demands on people's actions that are ethically supererogatory. Right? This idea that you should be devoting all of your discretionary income, everything that's not necessary for maintaining a sort of humble existence, to the welfare of others. Now, prima facie, our ordinary common sense notions, our intuitions, maybe our emotional reactions to these demands suggest that, hey, wow, that's ridiculous. That requires way too much of an agent. But someone like Mill might respond to that by saying, no, look, this is just an inconsistent and indefeasible intuition that you have about this case. You look at this case and you go like, oh, I have to sacrifice my happiness, my personal fulfillment for everybody else. And that can't be the ethical thing to do. That really isn't what ethics should require of me. But that's not really correct. If we think about that, so Mill might argue, really that is the right action. Our intuitions are wrong. They're not defeasible. So if everyone in the world acted in this dramatically selfless fashion, if everybody in the first world, for instance, worked to improve conditions in the developing world and impoverished nations, then everybody's in those nations, their lives would improve dramatically. And as a result, they would need less help from the first world. If everybody contributed to the welfare of society as a whole, then the amount of contribution that would be required would decrease dramatically. And so it seems like, on this response, utilitarianism requires this dramatic sacrifice. But what really is the case is that we're actually acting in ways that are inconsistent with our ethical obligations, that are not really defeasible if we really take equal consideration of others' interests into account in how we decide to spend our discretionary income or our free time. If we were just a little bit better, if we even just worked that extra shift or gave that extra bit of discretionary income out, what we discover is the need for us doing that gets decreased over time. And hence, our intuitions, our ordinary notions, our emotional reactions to these cases, they are the things to be abandoned, not the theory itself. In the next segment, we'll look at the last possible response strategy that a utilitarian theorist might adopt in isolation or in combination with these other strategies.